intimate since there's not too many of us. So my name is Roxana Althos. I'm the Associate Director of the International Human Rights Law Clinic. And it's really my pleasure to have Eddie Baglino with us this evening. It's a real treat. We don't often get the opportunity to have this kind of discussion about issues affecting the Caribbean. I feel like we often have that luxury on the East Coast, so we're happy to have this visitor from the East Coast. Eddie and I were talking about, we've known each other for so long that I forgot how we met originally, but we've been working on issues related specifically to the rights of Haitians and Dominican Haitians in the Dominican Republic for quite some time now. And we actually met thanks to a wonderful advocate named Solange Pierre, who was a Dominican Haitian feminist organizer, advocate, probably, although she didn't have a law degree, a better lawyer than I would ever be, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But I think will be remembered by history as one of the most important actors in the struggle for human rights in the Dominican Republic. So the clinic that I'm a part of litigated for 8 years a case against the Dominican Republic for the denial of rights to Haitians and Dominican Haitians. For decades now, the Dominican Republic has had the practice of, although the Dominican nationality, like our Constitution, recognizes the right of everyone born in the Dominican Republic to have the Dominican nationality. They have the practice of denying that right of nationality to children of Haitian ancestry born in the Dominican Republic. We sued the Dominican state successfully. We had a wonderful judgment from the Inter-American Court in 2005. And in the intervening years, the Dominican Republic has acted quite aggressively to turn practice into law. So that practice of denying Dominican-born children of Haitian ancestry their right to nationality, and therefore their right to own property, their right to marry, the full enjoyment of all their civil and political rights, their right to vote, was then translated into policy. And then in 2010, the Dominican Republic actually reformed their constitution and changed the nationality principle of their constitution to exclude from the right to nationality all children born of undocumented migrants. So after 2010, anyone born in the Dominican Republic inherited the legal status of their parents. And then in 2013, the Dominican state took it one step further. And in a 2013 decision by the highest court in the Dominican Republic, they applied that constitutional amendment retroactively to actually 1927. 29. And stripped tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people of their nationality. And right now the Dominican Republic is really living a very dire human rights and humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands of Haitians and Dominican Haitians have left that country fearing for their lives, and others are living now even more in the shadows, fearing that they can be rounded up similarly and deported en masse because of the color of their skin. Last week, the Inter-American Commission issued a 244-page report documenting the situation, documenting the status of rights in the Dominican Republic, and related to the problem of statelessness, one commissioner said that the problem is so profound in the Dominican Republic, it is a magnitude never before seen in the Americas. And so I think we have here someone who can help us understand the historical roots of this issue, the historical dimensions of this issue. So Eddie Baglino is an assistant professor in the Department of Global History at John Jay College, CUNY, where he teaches a class on the history of genocide, among other classes. He just published a book. On the relationship between the Dominican Republic and Haiti called Dividing Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic's border campaign against Haiti. He's a co-founder of Border of Lights. It's an organization dedicated to raising awareness about the victims of the 1937 massacre and promoting understanding between Haitians and Dominicans. His scholarship has, and the focus of his research has inspired him to interrogate his own identity and his romanticized notion of the diaspora Dominican identity in New York City through a performance of a play that he wrote called Eddie's Perejil. So his research has been supported by the Fulbright Foundation and National Endowment for the Humanities, and he's currently the 2015-2017 Public Scholar for the New York Council for the Humanities. So please join me in welcoming Professor Paulino.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Thank you, Roxana, for inviting me. Thank you, International Human Rights Law Clinic, for sponsoring the event, Berkeley. Not my first time here, but I am a native New Yorker, and native New Yorkers have this fondness for California. And I love Northern California, and it's a treat to be here and leave the 3-degree weather in New York. So what I want to do today is tell you a story in 3 parts about how I came to learn about this history and how we are trying to bear witness to, for lack of a better word, genocide in the 20th century. And so hopefully it will be coherent. If it's not, please tell me if you have any questions. I'm very excited for the Q&A because that's where I can kind of refine my thinking, which is, as everyone knows, you know, human beings are always evolving. So I was born in 1969, right? My parents are from the Dominican Republic. I was born in what is called the Lower East Side and Chinatown in Manhattan, right? So a different type of island than my parents. And you can see here, those brown high-rises that you see below the Brooklyn Bridge, they are the Alfred E. Smith public housing projects. Alfred E. Smith, the New York governor in the 20s, was from this area. And I grew up in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge. And like many children of immigrant kids, and especially many Dominicans, you know, one of my dreams was to grow up to be a baseball player, right? And indeed, I played baseball even through college, Division III, you know, not Division I, you know, Hurricane, University of Miami Hurricane. That was my kind of social milieu, you know, much like other children of immigrants in New York City, like Alfred Kazin, for example, whose parents are from Eastern Europe and Jewish, and grew up in Brownsville in East New York, and kind of like trying to understand who he was, growing up with 2 cultures, right? I pretty much fit that mold, right? But growing up, there was a shadow lurking, right? And that shadow, as some of you who might have read Junot Diaz's Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, or Julia Alvarez, The Time of the Butterflies, knows that this man cast a long shadow, not just on my family, but you know, many Dominican families, and a shadow throughout the Americas, including the United States. Even though he was assassinated in 1961, in the 70s and 80s, his shadow loomed large, right? So in order for us to understand this story, we have to talk about an archival letter and how I came to understand this history. And it starts with Dr. Lawrence Hauptman, one of my college professors and a mentor, and still we're really great friends, right? He's a native New Yorker from Brooklyn, not Manhattan, right? Poor working class Jewish family from Brooklyn. And for the grace of God, a Yankee fan. And we automatically connected in college. And I gave him my first paper. It was a U.S. foreign policy class. U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. And I gave him the paper. I was a freshman. I said, here. And I rushed it, you know? It wasn't good. He took the paper, he gave it back, he didn't even grade it. He said, you can do better. You can do better than that. It's like, wow, okay. I went back, you know, shame is a really good motivator. And I went back and revised and said, it's pretty good. He said, hey, I know your parents are Dominican, you're interested in Dominican Republic, why don't you come with me across the Poughkeepsie River to the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York. Because FDR was president from 33 to 45 and coincides with Trujillo. And perhaps you might find some documents that might interest you when you write, eventually, your senior thesis, right? So I went, and this is amazing, right? Like, this is, the apogee of American waspishness, right? This is FDR, this is Eleanor, right? The icon of, American feminism. And here they are, you get the tour, you see his wheelchair, right? They give you a tour upstairs, and then you go into the library, and you go into these spaces that really, people who are historically underrepresented or poor are not used to, right? You go in, you can't take any pens, they give you white gloves, you're only supposed to use their pencils, and there's this entire kind of language that comes with the archive. And I was like, oh my God, I'm being courted, right? It was this beginning of this love affair with documents, and I already knew I wanted to be a historian at this time, right? And so I started researching, right? And this was the object of my research. It was the Dominican Republic. It's a peninsula, not an island, and it is an anomaly in the Americas because where you only have two sovereign nations, independent, with embassies throughout the world, that share one island. 1/3 of the island on the west is Haiti, 2/3 on the east is Dominican Republic, and this is a legacy of European colonialism, right? Mostly French and Creole on the west, mostly Spanish in the east. And so, from a very young age, I was fascinated by this thing called Santo Domingo, La República Dominicana. And I always remember a friend of mine, this New Yorican kid, right? Because I grew up in the Lower East Side, where Dominicans were like 3 or 4. This is not Washington Heights. So most of my friends were African American, New Yoricans, and Cantonese-speaking Chinese Americans with 2 languages, with 2 names, right? You have your English name and your Chinese name, right? And so for me, this is the beginning of this romanticization of the DR, because I grew up in the 80s, and during the 80s in New York City, it was terrible because we were ravaged by crack. So aside from shootouts and being in the elevator, and you don't know who came in as a stranger, there's no security guard to protect you, it was really rough. And so for me, my Shangri-La, my refuge, was the Dominican Republic. Every time I went back 3.5 hours, back to a farm, back to drinking organic milk from the cow, and being able to fit in and being seen as part of the majority, right? And as I started focusing more on the DR, I noticed something very peculiar, right? This border, which is about 300 miles, as I started reading about it and visiting, I started noticing that unlike other borders that are very militarized, for most of the border, it's very porous, right? Like in the southern border here, where I visited with 60-year-old good friends, childhood friends, and they're like, you want to go to Haiti? They're Dominican. I said, yeah, come to my house. I go to the house in the morning, we have coffee, we walk 10 minutes, and all of a sudden, we go down this ravine, the bank, and they do something that they've been doing since they were 6. Before they cross the river, they take off their shoes, they put one sock in one shoe, the other sock in the other, roll up the pants of the hem of their pants, and then they cross the river. And as they cross, they switch from Spanish and they speak Creole, right? And this was the beginning for me of, oh, this is not the kind of monolithic border that I had read through the historiography of Trujillo, this monochromatic black and white division. It was more, there was overlap here, right? Here's another picture. This is not the south. This is in the northern town of Dajabón and Juanamint. And you can see there's no fence. There's no fence. There might be a gate here and there in some of the border crossings, but really for the most part is very, very porous. So as I am approaching this discovery for myself of the massacre, I find out that when Trujillo comes to power in 1930, there's several challenges, right? As soon as he comes to power, the capital is ravaged by a 5.0 hurricane called San Sedón, and it just devastates the entire capital of Santo Domingo, right? And so what he does, and he gains support from this, is because he was a good administrator, he really mobilizes the citizenry, and the city recovers in about a year and a half. And so what he does then is he looks around, because he came to power in a coup d'etat, and he says, what undermines my longevity? And what undermined his longevity was the border region. The border region, since the colonial era on Hispaniola, has been this semi-autonomous region outside of the reach of colonial empires, outside of the state, that they couldn't control. And when he comes to power and he starts knocking off and killing off his enemies, guess where many of them escape to? Or through where? They go through the border and they hide in Port-au-Prince, right? And so he says, one of the first things I have to do is I have to control the border, right? Because they can get weapons, they can overthrow me. And so what he does, in the early 1930s, one of the first things is he starts meeting with his presidential counterpart, Staniel Vincent, in DR and in Haiti to try to come up, for the first time in 300 years, a definitive border treaty, right? And these are kind of opposites, but not really, right? Trujillo, light-skinned, mulatto, working class background, believe it or not, his grandmother was Haitian. On the right, Staniel Vincent, Sorbonne educated mulatto, scion of a very wealthy mulatto Haitian family, right? Dressed in their diplomatic whites. And from 1933 to 1935, they start hammering out a border treaty, right? Literally, there's a bi-national commission, and what they do is, starting from the north to the south, they start detailing what land belongs to who, right? Is this Haiti or is this DR? No, that's Haiti. No, we agree? Good. This is Haiti, that's DR. And they do that through the 300-mile border. And what they do is, in order to demarcate, literally, the border, they put these pyramids along the border with numbers. And they can be as high, like this one in the Jabón, 3 or 4 feet high, to maybe 2 feet high. Some of them are blue, they're faded colors, some of them are yellow. But this is a MacGyver kind of like Bear Grylls survival. FYI. If you ever parachuted, if you ever get to the border and you parachute down at night on the DR Haitian border, and you see one of the pyramids, the way you know where you are is the number of the pyramid, right? So the lower the number, the more north you are, because the first pyramid starts in the north, in what is Monte Cristi. But if you end up somewhere near the water in the south, and you see the pyramid 333, that's, you know you're in the south, right? In Pedernales. So before we even talk about a massacre, we have to talk about, right, demarcating space, right? And in 1935, after painstakingly going through Haitian and Dominicans, through the border, and finally agreeing after 300 years, this is DR, that's Haiti, they signed a border treaty in 1935. Some of you might have seen 1936, but 1936 is when both Congresses ratified the treaty. 35 is the actual signing, as you see here. It was an amazing moment. If you look at the newspapers, Haitian and Dominican Republic, these two were just the heroes of the island. So much so that in 36, someone nominated them for the Nobel Prize in Peace, which of course they didn't get. But it's interesting to note that in 1936, Dominican-Haitian relations were at its most harmonious, right? Something you don't really think about, particularly going into the massacre, right? And the relationship was so friendly that Trujillo publicly and published in the Dominican newspaper says, I am proud to announce before my fellow citizens and before the world that a high proportion of African blood runs through my veins. He says this is Trujillo, right? So if in Haiti, if we were in the DR in 1936, it was a honeymoon, right? There's no anti-Haitian documents, there's no newspapers, there's no books against Haiti from the DR side, right? And this is important, right? Because of what I found in the archive. And it's this document that really propels me to this life of trying to understand what this is. And so imagine it's 1989, and I'm going through the documents with my white gloves, and I see this letter from the US ambassador in Santo Domingo to his boss in DC, Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, but also FDR is also seeing this, right, letter. And he says, and these are the words that really shocked me. It says, apparently with the approval of President Trujillo, a systematic campaign of extermination was directed against all Haitian residents. The drive was conducted with ruthless efficiency by the National Police and Army. A systematic campaign of extermination. I was like, what? I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it, right? Not my country, not my adopted homeland, you know, where at Christmas, every time I go, everybody, you know, they greet me with big kind of plates of light and dark colored rum with ice, right? Or where I take my 5 suitcases and everybody loves me and I felt most at home, where I could do no wrong. No, I didn't want to believe it. Because the diasporic identity of wanting to be back in a place where you weren't going to be profiled in the same way is very powerful. It cannot not be underestimated, right? So after this document, what I do is I start looking at other primary documents. And there are very few photographs. Like I teach a course on genocide, right? And one of the things about 20th century genocide with technology, like the Holocaust, right, that you have a lot of visual proof and evidence, right? As opposed to maybe the genocide of the Herero, which was the first genocide in the 20th century. The first modern genocide in the 20th century was Armenia, according to genocide scholars, right? But this is one of the few photographs with Trujillo, he orders the massacre, begins in late September and goes through mid-October, maybe sporadically late October, early November. And the best estimates are around 15,000. You might see 18,000, you might see as low as 4,000. The number I cite in my book is about 15,000, but I give a floor, 12,000, because for the first time in the book, I use documents from the Vatican secret archives, from the papal nuncio that Trujillo could not touch. So, and he gave a base of 9,000 at least, right? So imagine 1937, this genocide, this extermination going on, and this flood of people rushing from east to west. And the only pictures that we know of yet is these pictures taken from a book by a Dominican scholar, Bernardo Vega, in his book Trujillo and Haiti. And the guy on the right, who looks like a soldier, is part of the Haitian National Guard, set up by the US occupation forces who had retreated in 1934, who withdrew. And here you have not just textual proof from the ambassador, but you have visual proof of the refugees, right? Escaping the blade. And that guy in the middle is an American journalist called Quentin Reynolds, who used to write for Collier's magazine. And you couldn't go through DR because Trujillo had a moratorium on any press about the event, so you had to go into Haiti. And then he went to the border and they took photographs of what occurred. And it was random, right? Like Dominican military and police officers targeted people, right? And they weren't going to target people who looked like me. They were going to target people specifically who were dark-skinned with the escorts of the local people who knew the area and said, oh, that's a Haitian hamlet. Oh, that's a migrant community there. Let's go and get them, right? And many of them knew the people that they were being targeted because the borderlands, there were so many mixed unions, as I later found out. And this document really is powerful for me because, you know, when you think of Haiti, especially at that time, you don't think of Boy Scouts, right? Because you have all these stereotypes. Even DR, like DR has Boy Scouts, right? But, you know, Haiti in 1937 had their own contingent of Boy Scouts, right? Like, this is important because it kind of like challenges all these tropes about what Haiti represents, right? And what it's supposed to be, right? In the Western kind of imaginary, right? And as a historian, I not only relied on primary textual sources, documents, I also went and interviewed as many survivors as I can find and as many called escapins, those who escaped, and the perpetrators, Dominican killers, right? I got late, I went late, early 2000, and so many of them were dead, often senile, they weren't lucid in their mind, but I was able to get around 40, and I'm the only person that videotaped them, right? But you can't see it because IRB, right? They're locked away. But they told me these stories, and they didn't know each other, of how they actually committed this extermination. And it wasn't with guns. It was mostly, like Rwanda, with machetes, right? And a lot of these interviews, their testimonies, the information you don't find in the regular secondary source literature, right? The idea, this guy, he was about 99, right? He said, you know, they gave him a bottle of gas, a long needle, right? And they used to kind of, when they killed the Haitians, or Dominicans of Haitian descent, then their bodies, they burned them, right? And this is just, you know, as you see here, what they do is, what they did is make incisions between their toes and then put little twigs and then burn them up. In my play that I based this, you know, the guy's like, and then they burn up like, they burn like wood, like woof, woof. And he's like 70, 80 years old, and he's talking to me. Some are remorseful, some are not, and some you see, you know, I'm reminded by Hannah Arendt's book, you know, The Banality of Evil. Like, we're talking, and we're sitting down in this rural borderland area on the Dominican side of the border, and he's like, huh? Answering his partner. And he's like, and then he goes, what? And asks me, would you like some coffee? No. Where was I? Yes, I participated in the killings too. It's a matter of fact, right? But these were the voices, right, who are supposed to have no agency in a dictatorship, right? They're supposed to stay quiet. They're poor, they're people who work on the farms, and nobody cares about them, really. And obviously, in a court of law, they would be kind of Exhibit A. I also interviewed survivors, and part of the story here is that, like most genocides, there are always people of the perpetrator group who risk their life or their lives to save those who are being persecuted. We see this throughout all 20th century genocides, right? Schindler, Wallenberg, right? The guy from Rwanda that, you know, Don Cheadle played in Hotel Rwanda. Ruth Binga, I think, right? And so they told me, yes, there were some Dominicans who did help, right? So the dictatorship, like many dictatorships, are not this like total, absolute kind of, you know, power that controls everything. You know, people did risk their life, and that's important, right? Not to kind of ignore what happened, the responsibility for the Dominican state, but to show that there's, part of my argument is a longer history of collaboration between both people, right? And so I'm in college, I'm doing my master's, I'm doing my PhD, and I'm starting to connect this, right? So it's like, it's not that the DR is unique in this massacre, but it is that the Dominican case, or this massacre, is a case study in how states deal with minority groups, marginal, underrepresented groups, or groups that they feel are threatened, right? And it hit home to me when I visited places like Sachsenhausen, north of Berlin, right? Concentration camps, which this concentration camp was first a Nazi concentration camp, and then it was a Soviet. The Soviets took it over, okay? And this idea of destroying evidence and human beings is consistent in the way states dispose of bodies, right? So the Dominican state under Trujillo did not use crematories. They used more primitive means, but yet the objective was the same, right? They didn't want anyone to know, right? In the cover of Night. Here are the other pictures that you might find was in Life magazine. The reporters were able to get there. You can just find Life magazine, December 6, 1937, and they look eerily like 1994, right? Rwandan survivors. And they were targeted again because they were thought to be Haitian, which meant the way they were targeted is because of their complexion, of their race. They were black and they were dark skinned. Okay? The other thing I discovered in terms of this archival letter is that, something was in the water in the 30s and the 40s in the world, right? There's like the surge of fascism, right? But in the DR, the cross sections, right, exist because what you have is, and this is irony of ironies, right? When Trujillo orders the massacre, there's an international cause célèbre, and there's mass denunciations around the world, and they want him to not run for president in 38, which he doesn't. And so what he does, in order to gain graces and ingratiate himself to FDR, is he waits for the opportunity to get back in his favor. And one of the ways he does this, aside from supporting FDR against the Axis powers, is that he accepts several European Jews escaping Nazi Germany, right? And the famous story, right, is that there's a conference in Evian in Europe, and they're talking about Western powers. What are we going to do with European Jewry? What are we going to do? Nobody wants to take them, right? You know about the story about the United States and the St. Louis and turning them back. What do? The story goes, there's a Dominican representative there, and he stands up and he says, the Dominican Republic will take 100,000 Jews. So when FDR heard that, hey, Trujillo, right? You see the warming up. In the end, did he accept 100,000 Jews? No, he did not. But he did take about 600, right? And later, researching in the USS Holocaust Museum in DC, I saw that Bolivia took about 20,000. I mean, I saw it on the website. I had no idea, right? But, I mean, aside from American Jews or in Europe trying to kind of lobby and use anything necessary to help people flee, what it did for Trujillo is that he got back into the good graces of FDR, right? But it's important, right? Because irony of ironies, as you can see here, a picture, and in the back you see a photo of Trujillo. They could not leave that area, Sosua. It's not like you can go anywhere. You had to stay in that area. But the irony is, one group of people who were seen as racially inferior in Europe, escaping into this new place where now they're seen as white and their Jewishness is secondary. Why? Because for all intents and purposes, the Jews or the inferior people in the DR are Haitians, right? Interesting footnote in history, right? Another interesting kind of tidbit. Most 20th century genocides, you see the ideological campaign first and then the violence. In DR, it's the opposite. You see the violence and then you see the ideological campaign. That's rare, right? Because you need to kind of persuade the citizenry to say, like in Rwanda, my Hutu brothers and sisters, Tutsis, they're roaches. You have to squash them out, right? From the 80s up to 94. And then April 6th, the plane explodes or is shot down, as many say, and people are already accustomed to that, right? I mean, we can talk about the economic reasons also. But here, you have the inverse. And the people who led this ideological campaign to demonize Haiti, right? And to pick on this 19th century trope of Haiti as being the boogeyman of not just the DR, but the West, was the guy on the left, Peña Valle, and on the right, Joaquín Balaguer, who was one of Trujillo's right-hand ideological men and became president in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s. And the irony of all ironies, today, if you go to Santo Domingo, in the DR, there's a subway, and out of all the stops, there are 2 stops named after Peñavalle and named after Balaguer. So that's something for you to know about in terms of reconciliation, and also how do you remember the past and start creating a space for restorative justice, right? And this is a nice tidbit of one of his writings, right? Remember, this is the 40s, right? This is the moment, as Nancy Stepan talks, right? In the age of eugenics, right? Like, who's the superior race, right? And clearly, this is a racial kind of ideological project that exists here, right? And what you see in many of the books and the newspapers is going back to 1844, when the Dominican Republic was founded. And it was founded by expelling Haiti, that had occupied the entire island, or unified it, for 22 years, right? So what these Hispanophiles and Negrophobes, what they do is that they play on this kind of Western idea of Haiti as the enemy, right? Because Haiti, it's like, I don't care what you think I look like. I'm Dominican, it doesn't matter. But I'm not Haiti. We didn't overthrow white supremacy, right? So, like Silvio Torres Sayan talks about that. They always have used that in creating their kind of national identity. And as Silvio Torres Sayan says, Dominican elites, when they started creating the nation, they sided with the conquerors rather than the conquered, right? And we're going to see this over and over again, right? The 2 books, for me, that are seminal in understanding Dominican-Haitian relations in English, and what was occurring during the massacre, was Lauren Derby, who's at UCLA, a seminal article, and Richard Duritz, who's at William & Mary now, and The Foundations of Despotism. And both of them together, it's inarguable, right? That since the 18th, 19th century, the Dominican borderlands was this space, this liminal space, where Haitians and Dominicans traded with each other, had kids with each other, right? And there were real unions, and there was this strong, consistent collaboration between the 2. Like, if you look at the local history in the borderlands, that's the consistent history, right? But what you hear today is the opposite. Today, what you hear is that historically, Dominican-Haitian relations have always been adversarial, right? And that's part of what my book tries to kind of counter, right? And so what happens after the massacre, right? It's devoid of Haitians. And the Haitians were not just killed, it was their children also, who, when I interviewed them, they consider themselves Dominican. And after 60 years of having escaped from the Dominican Republic, and I went 2 hours away from the border in Haiti, and I put my tripod down, and I started filming them, guess what language I interviewed them in? Spanish. Even after 60 years, they hadn't forgotten. So when people tell you, they killed all the Haitians, well, no. Trujillo targeted the Haitian diaspora, but they also targeted people who considered themselves Dominicans of Haitian descent, right? And so Trujillo made no distinction. He conflated them all, right? Like what's happening now after the 2013 ruling, right? Group A and Group B, right? Immigrants, right? And people are, no, I'm not an immigrant. I was born and raised here. My parents and grandparents are Haitian, but I bleed Dominican, right? I tell this in my play. It's like there's a massacre in Boston, and the cops are targeting Dominicans, right? And they go up to the people to ask a certain shibboleth or linguistics test, because as you know, during the Haitian massacre, the story goes that the soldiers asked people, they didn't know because Dominicans could be black too. They said, okay, I want you to say a certain word, parsley, perejil. And because the Haitian R is softer, if you didn't say perejil, but you said perejil, you were Haitian, right? But that is partly a myth, right? Because again, many of them spoke Spanish, right? So I tell people, so imagine if I'm in Boston and the cops come up to me and they wonder if I'm Dominican or American, right? And they say, stop. I'm like, what? Say, repeat after me. Pak ka in Harvard, right? But they just don't ask my parents who came 50 years ago. They ask me, and they ask my kids who were born and raised here. The massacre conflated both, right? And that, I think, is important when you talk about the legacy of statelessness in the DR. And so what happens after the massacre, right, is a very well-known campaign called La Dominicanización de la Frontera, the Dominicanization or nationalization of the border, where Trujillo says, okay, I got rid of all the people, for now, and what I'm going to do is claim that territory as Dominican, because it always was beyond the reach of the state, right? It's like, you know, you never knew when you were in DR. Even today, you might not know when you're in DR, right? It's like you go to Canada. How do you know you're in Canada, right? How do you know you're not in the US? You see the Canadian flag. You see the Canadian currency, right? So, right, it's like my philosophy teacher, a professor at Michigan used to say, Dagmar Herzog, he said, how do you know a knife is a knife? So, because it's not a fork, right? I am what you're not. And so what he does is, since the DR is the superior people, I'm going to put along institutions that are explicitly modern, of concrete. And so he creates a plátano curtain, right? Everything that speaks to what Dominican and Dominican culture is. So the military establishes for the first time a very strong state presence on the border. He establishes schools. Forget about Creole. We're going to speak here the language of the motherland, which is Spanish, Español. Hospitals with the name of nationalistic heroes who fought against the Haitians during the independence wars in the 1840s and 50s, right? And political party offices. There was only one party, the Dominican Party, right? And here you can see in the left corner, it says, mis mejores amigos son los hombres de trabajo. Very, very common in fascist kind of governments, right? Like, my best friends are those who work, right? Of course, because if you work, then you don't have time to kind of question me and overthrow me, right? And this is something that even in New York City in the 90s, this ethic, this kind of like dictatorial residue still exists in the diaspora, right? Like when my family members raising us, they say, shh, the walls have ears, right? We could be careful, right? And of course the church. And the church was not only a religious institution, but it was a cultural and political institution that promoted and championed Trujillo's Dominicanization idea. And at this time, you see the emergence of this identity, of this, the Dominican state crystallizing a historically diffuse anti-Haitianism that said Dominicans are white, they're of Spanish descent, and they're Catholic, and Haitians are black, they are African descent, and they're not Christian, they are pagans, right? They practice voodoo, right? But in fact, if you go and you look at Haiti, even back then, most of the people were also Catholic. And they also, irony of ironies, had a campaign against voodoo, the Catholic Church in Haiti at the same time. But you would never know this with the historiography that the Trujillo intellectuals, these chicken hawks, who I call them, perpetuate. Musical bands, right? Rachmaninoff, right? Schubert, right? It's kind of European style danzas or music, right? And so what he does is that he transforms the border. So in 1916, there's a great book by Bruce Calder, really kind of the authoritative book on the US occupation, 1916 to 1924. And I cite, in my second chapter, I talk about the US occupation and their role on the border. And there's a 1922 US Senate inquiry on torture abuses of the US occupation forces. And lo and behold, what do you hear? What do you see the testimony? Waterboarding, in 1919 and 1920 and 19 waterboarding in the DR in Haiti, right? So the past is prologue. So in 1916, you have 3 border provinces, right? By the 1950s, the borderlands will be reshaped, right? You would have 5 border provinces, and many of the provinces had names of, this triumphalist, nationalistic nature, right? Like Independence Province, Benefactor Province, because that's the name of Trujillo, El Jefe, the chief, or Benefactor, right? Or Provincia Libertador, or Liberator Province, right? He's literally saying, this is where the DR begins and ends, right? And he totally transformed that region. So, after the massacre, look at this little interesting note from Ambassador Nora, the same guy who wrote Extermination of, just about extermination. Read that. This sounds like a Hollywood trailer, right? For like World War Z with Brad Pitt, or The Walking Dead, right? Like this is the apocalypse, right? If you read it. But really, historically, what he's saying, right? First, he puts the onus on Haiti, and he's saying, this is a powder keg. They're going to blow up, and you got to be careful, right? This kind of the black chaos is going to subsume the entire island, right? But in fact, if you look at the history of the Dominican-Haitian border, you will see that this is historically inaccurate. Because most of the history has been collaborative. It's not because I want to, it's because the evidence says it throughout. But there's this notion that we hear over and over again that there's this timeless quality of Dominicans, of anti-Haitianism, Dominican anti-Haitianism, right? Like you're born, I'm Dominican, and you hear as a baby, ga ga ga, I hate Haitians, right? That's the trope you hear because you see the massacre, right? You see the 2013, and that's real, and it's incredibly discriminatory, right? But if you argue that side, then what you're doing is you're adopting the the argument of the elite, right? And that's what, in my book, I try to push back against, right? Kind of like historically contextualize this event. 2, the activist. Sonia Pierre, I met her in the 90s, and that's like Roxana said, I met Roxana, this is amazing kind of activists and lawyers fighting for kind of human rights in the DR, right? And she was born and raised in the DR, poor, her parents are Haitian, and she was an incredibly powerful woman. She had this sense of integrity and justice, and she just wanted to be treated fairly and say, look, if I was born and raised here and I'm 50 years old, where am I going to go, right? That was a very simple notion, right? And her organization, which still exists today, MUDA, the Movement for Dominicans of Haitian Descent, every year they have a campaign to kind of educate the young kids especially, as you can see here. And one of their goals is a right to a nationality and a name, right? That's one of the human rights kind of charter and universal rights. Like you gotta have a nationality. You just can't be, like a kite in the wind, right? And so she is foundational when you talk about human rights in the DR with respect to the Haitian diaspora, right? And here you have young kids out in the street, protesting, right? Look familiar? Look familiar? Ferguson, look familiar, right? So we know this is very global, this idea of rights along the lines of race, but Sonia was also adamant that she sounded like an academic, right? You ever been in class and the professor says, you can't talk about race without talking about class, without talking about gender, right? And Sonia was like, it's about gender too. And many of the programs were educating the young girls, because as we know, right, you educate the girl and you lower the poverty in a country. And here was one of the most amazing moments in 2006 when she won the prestigious Robert Kennedy Human Rights Award. Roxana was there, we were there, and it was a powerful moment. This woman, very poor, but just for the strength of character and integrity, just You know, many people were saying she was on a short list for the Nobel. But when you talk about the DR, and you want to talk from a position of strength and knowledge, you have to talk about her. It's just there's no other way, right? And she was doing this at a time when the legal apparatus in the DR was strengthening and becoming more draconian, right? So in 2005, MUDA and other organizations, and Roxana was part of this brief also, they took their case to the Inter-American Court in San Jose, in Costa Rica, and the jury, the judges, you know, their verdict was against the Dominican government. They said this is discriminatory. But the court doesn't have any teeth, right? They can't go to the country and say, have you done it? Because if not, pow pow, you're gonna get arrested. They don't. So what did the Supreme Court did? A couple of months after, in December, they said, you know, no, we're not going to follow your verdict, right? This is our court, these are our laws, and this is about sovereignty, right? And as Roxana was saying, in the DR, since 1929, the law stated that to be a Dominican citizen, you were born in DR with the exception of two things, right? Whether you're the children of diplomats or you were in transit, right? And so what happens is that you have thousands of people in the DR who have been in the DR for 3-4 generations being viewed as being in transit, right? And so the question, logically, common sense is, how can you be in transit for 50 years, right? I mean, how can you do that? You cannot, right? And so Sonia helped me understand that it's not just about archival letters, but they're real people that when I got on my plane and I told the flight attendant, y'all have some coffee, going from Santo Domingo to New York, there were people back there and they were like, they still had to suffer, right? So she put a human face. Now, I'm not, you know, I wasn't a stranger to like inequality. I grew up in New York City in public housing, right? But I am looking at a place that was my escape now in a different way, right? This idea like, oh, there's an epiphany that I'll tell you about, remind me, about a restaurant. And the third and final leg of the stool is the internet, in trying to understand kind of bearing witness, right? And it all started with the two women on the right. Everybody knows, right? You have Edwidge Dandican, Haitian-American writer, Craig Crack on the left, Junot Diaz on the left, the bottom, Julia Alvarez on the right, and Michelle Walker, the bottom, who wrote Why the Cocks Fight. So Julia told me this last year. She said, you know, she was reading Michelle's book, Why the Cocks Fight. And Julia said, man, we need to do something on the border. They, you know, with all the laws and kind of the anti-Haitianism, everything you hear, we need to have some light. What do we do? Right? Because she's, let me tell you, Julia is like 1960s radical Hal, you know, Ginsburg, like that. She's a hippie. She's like, you know, very, you know, she lives in Vermont. You know, she's very, yeah, we can do this, right? But at that time, years ago, she, you know, the internet wasn't at where it is now, and she was very busy, right? So what happens? By like serendipity, she's on a book tour, and I get an email from Silvio Torres Sayan, professor at Syracuse, one of the founders of the Dominican Studies Institute, and he says, Edward, I know you're studying this. You might want to reach out to Julia Alvarez. She has this thing about lights. Like, really, Julia Alvarez? Like, she's one of my heroes? It's like, yes, contact her. So I contact her, he goes, yes, I've been thinking about, you know, like the Christos kind of exhibition, like lighting something up and bringing love to this place that has been maligned for so many years. I said, okay, where do we start? And so she said, let's think about it. But as she goes on tour, she's meeting all these people that will be the founders of Border of Lights, right? And what we do, by May or June, we have about 7 or 8 people together. And every Wednesday at 10, we get on this, welcome to the Wigio Conference Center. Please punch in your name. And for an hour, from April, May to September, every week, we think about what governments do after post-Reconstruction. How do you bear witness to a genocide? How do you do that? Do you use poems? Do you use objects? Do you protest? Do you write letters? How do you do that? You gotta do a literature review. I'm the historian, I do the literature review. I was like, sorry people, we can't do the Nuremberg trials because we can't do that. He's dead, right? And so here we started really thinking about something that no one taught us about. And that is, how do you bear witness when the people who are responsible are dead or they're just senile? You cannot dig up and you cannot exhume the bones, put them back together and put them, right, on trial. You can't do that, right? So then what do? Because there is, even in the diaspora, there is this rage against Trujillo, right? I mean, think about all those exiles, Cuban exiles or other exiles from around the world who like have, you know, or against Chavez, right? Either left or right, you have this visceral rage against the leader who destroyed your world. Now I can't go to play dates anymore in Havana, damn it. Now I have to be in this place called Hialeah, right? That's real, right? And so one of the things we said, we need money. So what do? Kickstarter. And so we did a Kickstarter campaign, and Kickstarter is tough because if you say you're gonna raise $2,500 in 30 days, you have to raise $2,500. If 25 days come and go and you don't have $2,500, Kickstarter gets everything. So it's an incentive, right? And we might do Indiegogo, I think, this year, right? And so we have the website, Border of Lights, which you can see. We have a K through 12 kind of toolkit for teachers, right? So we said, you know, we need to educate. The other thing, we need money to kind of support. And so we got the Kickstarter. But then, how do we engage in the community? Art is very important, right? And so we got this woman here, Sherezaze Garcia. She's a professor at the Parsons School of Design in New York City, and a good friend of ours and one of the co-founders. And incidentally, this is like a random kind of trivial thing, but you know, when her mother was pregnant with her mother met Mao Zedong because her mother was part of the leftist radical Dominicans who happened to be in China, right? And so she came up with this idea of doing postcards because it's about dialogue, right? Genocide, right? Usually silences people, right? I always teach, I love graphic novels and I teach Art Spiegelman's Maus, right? And like we know that after the Holocaust, that generation that survived didn't want to say anything. And it's only after like the documentary Shoah in the 70s and the 80s when people just started to take, yeah, I was there, right? So for us, it was like, let's create a space so ordinary people can just say something and talk, because dictatorships take away that voice. And so what she did is, she did a series of postcards. On one side, 2 faces representing DR and Haiti. And on the back, stamps of both countries, and then you see the DR, the year, and then in Spanish, she said, Cuéntame, ¿qué te contaron? Tell me, what did they tell you? About what? About the massacre, right? And what she did, it was ingenious, is we went to the gazebo at the center of town, in the Central Park, and we put rope around the gazebo, and we took bobby pins, and then we clipped on the postcards like laundry that's being aired, right? And then we had Sharpies on the side, and so you have people just walking across of every background and saying, ¿Qué es esto? ¿Qué es esta vaina? What is this? What is this? And we're like, whatever you want. Look, whatever I want, yes, we're not going to tell you anything. You're not going to tell me? No. You can even keep the Sharpie. Really? You don't have to write your name. Just say it. And they came, right? And children, school kids, police officers, military people who had to kind of jostle their M16, right, to sign something, right? And just this was amazing, incredible dialogue. And this is one of the most important scenes. And I just have a few minutes and that's it. There were shoeshine boys who also wrote their experiences of what they heard and how they were Dominicans and Dominicans of Haitian descent. There was this amazing scene where one of the kids taps me and said, "Oye," he's like, "You know, my friend wants to write something." I was like, "Well, let him write." He goes, "But he can't write, and he doesn't know how to read." He was like 11. And so I said, "Can you read? Can you write?" I said, "Yeah." Well, then you go and let him dictate to you. So he goes, and right now he's dictating what the kid is saying, right? So this might be trivial, like, so what? But you know, like, I play the long game, right? It's like these kids are not supposed to count, right? Like, you know, it's a kind of like, how do you get back at a dictator, right? You can't hit him, right? How do you do it? This is one way. We not only did it in the Dominican side of the border, we did it on the Haitian side. And then what we also did the next year is we had big postcards, stickers that we stuck on the wall. And people just writing. And no comments were negative on the border. They said, "There are our brothers. My comadre is Haitian and I'm Dominican. You people don't understand the border. We're the alpha omega of the country." Right? These are border residents, right? And what we do, so with the Kickstarter, we not only go and do community projects, what the community tells us, whatever you want. You want to plant a tree? We'll do it. We're not the protagonists. We help you, right? We just facilitate. And so we have 3 legs of a stool. One is helping the community. The second is we do a global vigil. And so for people who can't come, we get on Twitter and Facebook. And on that Friday night, we take questions from all over the world asking us, what's the massacre? What are Dominicans? What do they speak? All these very interesting questions. And we kind of try through technology, through the internet, to democratize this conversation. And last year, we also have, what do you call that? Not the haters, when people try to troll. Oh my God, trolls. I can talk to you about trolls. But we had to X them out because they were like, you know, the ultra-nationalists. It's Andrews Dandicat. And hopefully next year or this year, you guys can join us. If you can't be in DR or Haiti, you can, what we ask you is to do a selfie of a candle and send it to us. And we just upload it, kind of like camaraderie internationally. We have some of the people from around the world. The third thing and last thing that we do is we commemorate those victims who were killed by doing a mass headed by the Jesuits, who we work with, and Juanitas, these hardcore nuns who are Colombian in Haiti. And what we do when they leave the mass, we give each of them, part of the Kickstarter funds, a candle and a flower. And then for 15 minutes, we walk to the border. And this is an amazing group of people, it's like 100 every year, walking to the border, walking to the site of where these people, these escapins, try to run away from the flying machetes, from the blades. And we go there and we sing songs, we say, poetry, and then we recite poetry, and then we put the candles all along this gate where you can see the river. And the first year was powerful because at the same time we were putting up the candles and taking paper mache boats with a candle and putting them on the river going down, the Haitians on the other side were doing the same thing, right? So it's this amazing moment. And then, guess what? They turned to me, a little old historian, and they're like, put it into context what's going on. I was never trained for that. Because historians like, come on, Look, Mom, he's a historian. Oh, Jesus, right? Like, historians, we don't, we're not, all hedge fund, right? Like the, but, I am honored to be a historian, right? I'm a Jedi for history. And so it's amazing to be there every October and then to put it into context. I wasn't trained for this, and say, imagine 70, 75 years ago on this balmy night, imagine the splashing of the waters. Imagine the screams, as the survivors told me, of people trying to make it across that river. Imagine yourself in those shoes. And so in many ways, like the US, we are saying, but we never explicitly say it, is that those lives who happen to be of Haitian or Haitian descent, happen to be black, they matter. They also matter, and who happen to be poor. And we do that every year. And we leave the candles. We leave them, and then we leave. And so, lastly, all of this is important because in 2013, right, in 2010, Juliana Díaz-Pierre, she goes and she has her birth certificate. She wants to take out her national ID card. The Junta Central Electoral, which is like a kind of DMV electoral board who gives out official documents, takes her card away and says, no, you don't qualify, right? They profile her. And so from 2010 to 2013, she, with kind of activist groups, nonprofits, have a case that goes all the way up to what is called the Constitutional Tribunal. It's like kind of like equivalent of the Supreme Court, and they have a ruling. And the ruling is what Roxana just had mentioned earlier. Really that, now in transit means that you are a non-resident foreigner, right? And it doesn't matter if you're here for 4 generations. It's retroactive to 1929. And so the entire world saw this for what it is. This is just like a discriminatory and act to strip a community, the largest ethnic and racial community in the DR, of their rights and to make them stateless, right? And this, again, is that Article 11 that keeps popping up. You can see the Human Rights Watch report from 2015, 2016, the Amnesty International report. You can see the latest one, the Inter-American report with the plus 200 pages, and they'll say it clearly. They went throughout the country and they talked to communities of Haitian descent, and it was the same pattern. We are being excluded, right? And it's not just limited to the DR, but DR is a case study of this, right? And this is the famous tribunal. A lot of people never saw the tribunal. They hear about it, but they never think about it. But here they are, the 13 members. 2 of them are women. The ruling wasn't unanimous. 2 judges ruled against the ruling. Guess what gender those 2 judges belong to? They were women. 2 women said no, right? And that guy, we can talk about him. He was responsible for importing many Haitian braceros in the 80s, right? As a high kind of politician, the secretary of Milton Guevara, the guy here, right there, right? And we will talk about how the state is complicit in this, in the growth of the Haitian population here. Eventually, Juliana, because of the international outcry, receives her national ID card. But after the 2013 ruling, the president, under enormous pressure, goes to Congress, and the Congress passes a 2014 regularization. We're going to regulate. We're going to, fix this, for the first time. And ironically, for the first time, something is done, right? Like, so they have some credit historically because it's never been done. But the problem is, right? It's incomplete because they create 2 groups. Right? One group who had documents and they were stripped, and the other group that, for whatever reason, never had documents but were like 2nd or 3rd generation, born and raised in the DR, right? And so last year, the government said there's 50,000 people we finally found they have, and they published the names. We have their names, their IDs, and they can come get it. But if you talk to people on the ground, Muda and Reconocí and people like that, they're like maybe 20, maybe 30. But really, and they don't criticize the president, right? Understandably, right? They have to be also strategic, but really, genuinely, their problem is with this guy, right? With the Junta Central and with the guy, with the tribunal, and with the guy who heads the Junta Central. The people who you go to and say, here's my birth certificate, and they'll say, great, here's your national ID card, cédula, and with that, I can go to school, I can get married, I can go play in Port St. Lucie for the Mets, because the Mets want to just sign me. But what you're seeing is that Dominicans of Haitian descent, amazing baseball players too, the scouts are like, the Yankees want to, we're going to sign. All you need is an ID so that you can get on a plane. And he goes, I can't get an ID. They don't want to give me an ID. This 18-year-old is going to go to the US and represent the Dominican flag But he can't do that because he's denied. And he's like 18. He goes, I haven't gone to Haiti. I don't even know Creole. So it's a political quagmire at a time when the Dominican, the political party, the PLD, is incredibly corrupt and has spent many years there, and people are just extremely turned off the high crime rates, etc., and the impunity. And so just in the last 2 minutes, what you saw after 2013, the ruling, this rise in kind of attacks against Haitians by Dominican ultra nationalists. And here, this is the migration website saying, basically, if you see something, say something. Basically, if you see an undocumented person, call this number, to denounce foreigners in an irregular situation in the country, please call. That's, it's like, hey, if you see Carlos in Ashbury, call La Viga. Just like that, right? That's the DR, right? I don't want to get ahead of myself because the US is not like, we could talk about the US also, but it's a global thing. And what you see in the rise of ultranationalism is that there's a space where people can go and kind of go the extra mile to express their sentiments. And here, we just celebrated this month the 1-year anniversary of the lynching of a Haitian man called Tulile in the second largest city of Santiago. Many Dominicans today say it was Haitians and he was abandoned, etc. But if you talk to the people in the park, he said he was a family man, he was a father, he was a husband, he was 22 years old, and he sold everyday food there, right? So for me, it's common sense. There's a rhetoric of hate, and it's being ramped up by ultranationalists defending Dominican sovereignty, and then you have this lynching, right? So it's the situation is dire. We have Amnesty International reports, thanks to many international organizations, and also, let's be clear, there are organizations in DR that are not of of Haitian descent, and they could be, for gender rights, etc., but they all are in support, or mostly, of this movement. The other thing that I want to leave you with today is there's a kind of X factor, and that's the Dominican diaspora in the United States particularly. This was this year's Dominican Day Parade. I was there, and as you can see here, look, they have 3 Dominican figures of Dominican history. On the right, Afro-Dominican Mama Tingo. To the far left, a Dominican soldier called Luperón, who fought against the Spaniards and kicked them out. And then you have Sonia Pierre. So you have you have American kids, born and raised in the US, kind of at the forefront of claiming and helping these groups in DR to claim their rights, right? And you have people like Rosa Iris, who's also a friend of mine, and every week they go to the office of the Constitutional Tribunal to protest, legally and non-violently. And here is very quickly, this just happened in 2015, protest at the same time that the protest was happening in DR, Skyping, in front of the UN. And just look at the bottom where it says, yes to human rights, no to apartheid, no to racism, no to civil genocide, to expulsion of families. And then above the flag, it says, Trujillo did it in 1937, we say no to Medina, the president, in 2015. I didn't tell him to say that. But the young kids are making that connection, right? They said in 1937, the genocide was with a knife. Today, the genocide is with a pen, right? And of course, you know him, who the New York Dominican consul, Selman, said, we're going to strip the Dominican high prize to Junot because he's an anti-Dominican, right? And basically that's what Junot said. He's like, first of all, I never accepted the prize. And second of all, you guys are illegal. You guys are passing discriminatory laws, and you're not connecting the fact that people in the diaspora also have to go through similar issues. Because as a Dominican doctor in New York says, we Dominicans are all Haitians here in the United States. And I just want to give you a quick diasporic kind of view of Dominican life, you know, particularly the guy on the right, who was the first Dominican, the first US soldier of Dominican descent killed in Iraq. So when we in the diaspora say, I know what's happening there, it's because we experience it here, right? And so those three things, I think, helped me understand that even though I was raised as a racial and ethnic minority in New York City, lacking particular cultural and racial privileges, in the DR, yo soy el blanquito. I'm the white guy in the DR. Because in DR, I'm not going to get profiled in the same way. And as the late Juan Flores, one of my mentors at NYU used to say, I said, why don't you want to keep going to DR? I go to DR, but I just don't feel the same. He said, that privilege, right? He goes, yeah. I said, yeah. He goes, it's seductive, right? Yeah, it is. You know what it is to go into a fancy restaurant and it's like going to the French Laundry? How are you? And treating me like I belong there, like I could do no wrong. I was like, wow, that's the way it feels. And so that's how I broke up with the DR. We're still cordial. We go back every year. But for many of my sisters and brothers in the diaspora, it's incredibly hard to give up on that romanticized relationship. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions and answers. So I'm going to ask, I know there's a great Berkeley tradition of asking questions that seem more like comments than questions. So I'm going to ask you to try to take advantage of Professor Flaviano's presence and ask questions about his talk.
I want to ask you more about the Supreme Court's ruling, the Constitutional ruling.
Yeah.
I think you said there was that they changed the Constitution in 2010.
Yes, they did.
Okay, but this whole in-transit distinction, which sounds just totally, like just disingenuous, but what's kind of the historical or legal basis for that in terms of changing the Constitution, as opposed to using explicitly kind of racial categories like in old post-colonial, colonial Latin America, where they had all these different racial categories.
That's a really great question. Legally, the precedent is 1929. I'm glad you asked me because it goes back to 1929 to the Constitution, Article 8.2. All persons born in the territory of the Republic, with the exception of the legitimate children of foreigners resident in the Republic as diplomatic representatives or in transit. And so this article becomes Article 11 in 1966, 1994, and 2002 constitutional reforms, right? Like what in Latin America people call la constituyente, right? Like every so often, constitution gets revised, right? What makes the DR different is that they have Haiti, right? There's a great book by Pedro San Miguel, a Puerto Rican scholar, historian, Imagine Islands, and Michel Bard also talks about this. He says, you know, in the 19th century, in the 1850s and 60s, at a time where Latin American countries were kind of coming into their own as independent nations and rejecting Europe as a colonial power, the DR was doing the opposite, right? Remember, in 1844, the DR has its national independence and kicks out the Haitians. And so from 1844 to 1855 and 1856, there are several military invasions from Haiti, and they all are repelled. By 1856, no more Haitian invasions. But this is 1856. There are a lot of countries that have slavery. Cuba, Puerto Rico, the US is about to go into their civil war. And so, right, there was a struggle within the Dominican elites of whether you could sustain this political independence, right? With all the political turmoil going on, the geopolitics. And so what happens in 1861 is that, of all ironies, the DR goes back to the colonial fold and invites Spain to annex it back. You don't see that, right? Why? Because they're playing on the fear of Haiti, and like European powers are like, yeah, I get it. Haiti very bad, right? And so, it's only because the Spanish annexed the DR from 1861 to 1865 that it provokes like a real national movement for liberation. And the Dominican Marxist historian Roberto Casas says that he argues that the real war of independence was what they call the restauración, the restoration in the 1860s, and not Haiti, because that really is where you saw kind of the nation coming together. So to get to your point, a lot of these racial categories throughout Latin America and Spanish-speaking, the DR, exist. But the other in Brazil was the black or indigenous, right? The other in DR wasn't a black Dominican. It became, through elite projects, the Haitian, right? So someone like me, or anyone, regardless of their color, right? They can kind of claim this identity as Dominican by pushing away Haiti, right? So the DR is, in terms of the history of Spanish colonialism in the Americas, is different because of its relationship with Haiti. And it's Haiti, it's because of Haiti that DR becomes, slavery is abolished, right? So from 1822 to 1844, when Haiti unified the island, many of those black and mulatto, what would be Dominicans, they savored in real time what freedom was, right? And that's, that can't not be underestimated, right? So by 1844, when they kick out the Haitians, right, there are factions. There are pro-French Dominican forces, pro-Haitian Dominican forces, right, kind of independence from Europe. And because the black and mulatto population had a history, a type of slavery that didn't rely on a kind of plantocracy or like the industrial nature of slavery, and because they saw 22 years of abolition, they forced the hand of those in power to make sure that the Constitution in 1844, they wrote in the Constitution that slavery would forever be abolished in what is the Dominican Republic, right? That's why, Haiti, if you do Latin America, people, you have to talk about Haiti, right? It's like, well, no, I'm majoring in Latin America. So I do Colombia and I do Argentina, and yeah, Brazil is big, so you have to do that. But why Haiti? You have to, right? Haiti is at the cross-section of empire and slavery. Simón Bolívar, you can't talk about Haiti without Simón Bolívar's kind of full support of Haiti, which in the end he never helped out. So that's why, racial categories notwithstanding, they do exist in the DR. But I think that's the relationship that I argue that has to be revised in the 21st century, right? When you hear Dominicans talk about, when they say, oh my God, people are attacking us all over the world. They say that we're racist, right? And I'm thinking, it's because you guys, first of all, it's your responsibility for the ruling in 2013, and it's also how you tell the story, right? And so the Dominicans, you don't have to say that, you don't have to defend yourself saying we're not racist. All you have to look is the history. Dominicans have a trust fund in terms of solidarity with Haiti and kind of their bona fides in terms of blackness, right? I say, and this is something that people get kind of surprised at, I said, before the United States had its first black president, the Dominican Republic, as this kind of Hispanophile country in the 19th century, had a black president, Ulises Heró, 1882 to 1899, right? And the DR, for as many people want to kind of perpetuate that elite vision that they've always been separated. The DR is the cradle of blackness in the Americas. This is Silvio Torres Ayan's first sentence in this great article called The Tribulations of Blackness. The DR is the cradle of blackness in the Americas. This is the first time in the Americas where Africans arrived and were enslaved and also became cimarrones after the indigenous. That's 85% black life, right? But yet, in the perception today, is that it's not. And I think historians play a role in that. Sorry about the long answer.
We can take a couple more questions, and then I think we're going to have to end. We're a bit over time. So why don't we take a couple more questions, and then I'll let
Thank you so much for coming here and giving this presentation. Given that it seems like a lot of the documents were destroyed and there's just not a lot of information out there, what information gaps are still exist about the massacre? What do we still not know?
Well,
Any other questions?
yeah.
Go ahead, Casey.
So I'm really interested in how you argue that the ideological campaign came after the Afro massacre, and I'm interested in how you got kind of like the neighbors across the border or neighbors that have been interacting with these people their entire lives to sign on to helping exterminate these people without the ideological campaign perceived.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good book.
Yeah. Well, let me take the first one. I mean, a lot has been covered. I mean, I gave a historiographical review. A lot has been covered about the massacre and pre-massacre, but not post-massacre, right? So, like, I think mine is the first book that talks about what happened after the massacre, right? And I think it is as interesting as what happens before. But that's a great question for a historian, right? Like, because we still don't know what documents are out there. I can tell you that what I would like to see is a history of the massacre from the Haitian side, right? With Haitian sources. And I talk about why I didn't focus on the Haitian side. Like, I was very honest, it's like before you think that, I'm Xing out Haiti again and being another kind of Haiti Dominican or a white guy, these are the reasons why, right? And I think what I argue is that this is the responsibility for us in the diaspora to kind of, as Duyot says, silencing the past or unsilencing these histories, right? So it's, like Lucia Suarez says, it's the responsibility of those writers in the diaspora to uncover the stories of our journeys, right? But I think Haitians should tell the story, what's happening, in terms of personal, the memoirs and personal papers of politicians, whole, diplomatic correspondence between not just the U.S. and Haiti, which in the FDR library, you can get the Haitian correspondence in French, right? So what was interesting is that I was seeing letters in Spanish and English to DC, the Secretary of State, and also FDR. And then Trujillo was writing personally and his people in Spanish and in English, right? And it's great. Trujillo was saying, oh, we didn't murder anyone. And then Vincent is writing saying to FDR, yeah, there are people who've been murdered. And I think it was the Dominicans. So we're still waiting. And there's a section in the Vatican Secret Archives that it's from 1937 to 1941, but it's locked. And you can't get to it unless the Pope every year, right? The Pope every year, he goes to the Vatican Secret Archives and then he kind of releases some documents to the public that you can go study. This particular section, ecclesiastical section, I write about it in my book, is closed. And only until either this Pope or the next Pope opens it, we won't know, right? So there's still, right, all these, you still can peel more layers of that because it's not just Dominican history or Haitian history, it's American history. And by the way, before I get to your point, the way the U.S. responded to the massacre fits the pattern of 20th century U.S. response to mass murder.
if you read Samantha Power's, Problem from Hell, from Armenia, Morgenthau's letter to Clinton and Rwanda to Cambodia, right, and Kissinger, the U.S. Was indifferent, to say the least, right? You can argue a little with Clinton and Kosovo with the bombings, right? But, right, so this is shameful kind of history where the U.S. has not kind of promoted its ideals of democracy by stopping mass murder, right? And so your question about how did the government persuade or force Dominicans on the ground to participate in mass murder if they had not been brainwashed yet, right? Many of the people I interviewed told me, what Hannah Arendt said. They were following orders, and many of them knew the people they were being killed. There was one guy who said he had adopted a Haitian boy who was about 12, and the soldiers came to him because he was an elder in the community, and they wanted to take the boy. And he said, no, I know him, I can vouch for him, he works here, don't worry, he's not going to do anything, but this is what Trujillo said, there's no questioning, this is what you have to do. And he tells me they took the boy. And he says, like his voice cracking up, saying, and I think they killed him on the road. Right? So a lot of it was fear. I interviewed some who said, it was, our duty to defend the nation, right? Because remember, you had this diffuse kind of, sentiment of prejudice, but it wasn't crystallized until Trujillo arrived, right? And it was so traumatic, that massacre, right? Like, Turitz has this article that the title is "A World Destroyed, a Nation Imposed," right? Most of the people I interviewed, on both sides said before the massacre, most of the people who were living on the border were Haitian, and they owned property, and they were of stature. In this set, I think we have less kind of state-driven ideology, like radio kind of slogans every day, and just a lot of it was fear. And I asked him, I said, why didn't you just say no? He's like, I was going to get killed, He's like, if you said no back then, he goes, I'm talking to you now because it's a democracy. But back then, if I said no, they would put me in a chair. He said, they would put me in a chair, strap me up, press a button, send me to this infamous prison called La 40, in the capital, and that was the end of it. And I would say, no, I don't want to talk to you. I know nothing. No, papi, I don't want to talk to you. Right? So a lot of it was this kind of overwhelming kind of fear in the dictatorships. And of course, some people didn't need persuaded. But that fear transcends the nation, right? There's a great article by, believe it or not, by the New York Times columnist David Brooks, and he talks about post-traumatic stress syndrome with American parents. Like he says, you can tell who are the Generation X parents in the playground with their kids, because they're the ones that are always like, hey, are you okay? No, don't touch this. You're okay. This and that, right? Because we lived like the 80s and it was crazy and this and that, right? Like this trauma. And I think that even though I was born in '69, my parents experienced the dictatorship. And I think that in the parenting, in the way my parents raised us, I think, I know that influence was palpable in this idea of do not challenge the state. Now, other Dominicans might say, you gotta fight the power. But for us, it was like, you're gonna get kidnapped and they're gonna put electric prods on your genitalia and zap you, right? For me, things that I wouldn't associate with DR growing up, but I later would come to associate with Chile, right? But the DR also had its dirty war from 66 to 78, right? Yeah, like, why do people commit violence? Sometimes it takes a state project, sometimes you know, it could be much more simple.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.